Hello and welcome to a production of Mylan K Resources. I'm Mylan Yurkovich, together with my wife Kay, and today we're discussing the love style of the vacillator. Hi, Kay.
Hi, honey.
How are you?
Good.
Hey, we talk about these love styles, and really they're not personality types. I just think it's important for us to restate that these are wounded states.
That's right. These imprints come from our childhood experiences. And we also want to remind our listeners that we're not blaming parents. We're just talking about common things that are often broken in homes that produce these love styles. And so in the vacillator's home growing up, many times they get some great connection, but it's inconsistent. And it's often more based on the parent's mood or need to give than it is where the child is at or what they might need. So these kids tend to be left waiting and wanting for that parent to be attentive again.
And that's miserable for them.
The waiting gets really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so as the parent is finally available again, the child now has a dilemma because they're angry that they had to wait, and yet they want the connection. So there's this push-pull inside of them. So when the parent comes back, they may display anger and desire at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that's confusing for the parent and the child. But you might say these kids turn their longing for connection on high, whereas the avoider dampens their need for connection and the pleaser scurries around to make you happy so you'll connect. The vacillator turns that connection on high and sometimes even exaggerates what they're trying to get across to make connection happen.
Yeah, if I scream louder, or if I look for something that's intense, I long to be connected to something that's consistent. Now, you just spoke about the anger, pushing somebody away, and the desire to be close. And that's why vacillators in the attachment research are called ambivalent. They're ambivalent about the connection with people oftentimes, especially if that person has caused them to feel some pain. They want to be close, but then they push them away. So this term vacillator, they're also referred to as preoccupied. Now, that is how we describe these people. They have a push-pull, and they're also preoccupied. Would you explain what the preoccupied part is?
Well, as we begin to describe the vacillator, one of the things that they tend to do is, as they move into adulthood, they tend to do a lot of rehearsing and reviewing. And what I mean by that is that when they're desiring connection with someone, they rehearse ahead of time. How is this going to be? And they start to idealize this picture of my husband coming home, or how is this vacation going to be? How is this date going to be? And they paint this picture of pretty much all good, wonderful loveliness. Mm-hmm. And then the event happens, and of course nothing's ideal, so there's usually some amount of disappointment. And afterwards, they review their disappointment, they mull on it, they ruminate about it. Maybe they're reviewing their own behavior. I wish I would have said this. Mm-hmm. Oh, I wonder if that girl at the Bible study likes me. She seems so distant today. And in that process of reviewing, they're either ruminating about someone they're angry at, and that anger is building, or they're really angry with themselves because they've decided that they didn't do something correctly. And in that little private world, they can be very hard on themselves. Mm. But sadly, no one ever sees that world.
Sure. I think, Kate, based upon something you said a moment ago, this started in their childhood because the parent is intermittent in their connection with them, and the child's left not just longing for connection, but they're trying to figure it out in their little mind. Why don't people want me? And so they can feel very self-conscious about, am I wanted or not wanted? And along with that comes shame. And that's why they do the reviewing and rehearsing so much. And they're self-conscious and they're very preoccupied. So they're just trying to figure it out, even as adults, that pattern that started as a child continues with them on into adulthood.
That's so true.
Yes?
What are some of the other characteristics that you see of the adult vacillator?
Well, because they long for that connection, as you said a moment ago, they start all adult romantic relationships in a highly idealized state. And when we date, there is a high intense connection factor. And then they think this is reality, and they think dating and the falling in love stage is the reality of what they want to feel the rest of their lives. And then when they get disappointed at certain points of time, which may not take that long, or it could take a while, they're so disappointed they devalue the other person. So they go from they are all good to all bad. And then what happens is what we call that is that's like a good bad split. You start off that they're all good, and then you go to a place where you're all bad. Now they can do that with themselves, like you just said. They can beat themselves up a lot, or they can do a good bad split with other people or churches or organizations or teachers who are teaching their kids. They can apply that anywhere.
And I think that's one of the most painful parts of being a vacillator. We often say that we feel like this lifestyle perhaps is got the most pain of anyone because the avoider just shuts it off. The pleasers distracting themselves with fixing and pleasing. But the vacillator just feels this longing and this emptiness and this anger and this desire and this disappointment all the time. And, the devaluing, idealizing and devaluing is exhausting.
Yeah.
And, I had a vacillator for a parent. My dad was a vacillator. And as I think back to my relationship with him, it was either really good and really fun and he was in a great mood, or he was in a terrible mood and you just knew to stay away from it and it was really bad.
Right.
So there was no middle for him in our relationship. There's no middle ground. And I think that's what the vacillator experiences. It's very hard for them to find middle ground.
What about, Kay, just what does the vacillator male tend to be like, the characteristics of this person, when, let's say, their wife has a baby?
Well, I think the vacillator always feels threatened by intrusions of other people or time spent with other people. And many times before a child is born, there's a pretty intense connection between the couple. And of course, the vacillator desires a lot of intense connection. And then when a baby comes along, they're just a bundle of feelings and needs, and they take a lot of time and attention. And many times the male vacillator feels very displaced, actually jealous of the baby, but that's very hard to admit. And so their anger and their dissatisfaction tends to really increase after the birth of a child, especially when they take so much time.
Well, and for the mom is connecting with the baby, and all of a sudden she experiences a shift inside herself with respect to the mother bond and attachment. And her priorities also change at that point. So vacillators don't share well, do they?
No, they don't, because it means that they may lose even more than they feel they're already losing in terms of connection. And I think for the female vacillator, when she has a child, it really meets a deep need for that special longing and connection is really met. This baby needs me. This baby adores me. This baby smiles at me. And
I'm the life giver to this baby.
I'm the life giver. And so, especially in the really dependent stages of infancy and toddlerhood, most vacillators love that period of parenting, most women.
Absolutely.
And they struggle when that little kid puts their hands on their hips and cocks their head and says, no, or I do it my way. And then the vacillator can often, without realizing it, interpret that as rejection.
Oh, they do. And then they get angry at the child.
And even if they can contain that anger inside, they feel angry and don't really understand why. And so the longing to have another baby can really take place at that point. And so these are patterns that often vacillators don't realize are there. But when we point them out, they can see, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I feel or how I did feel.
Right. And I think one more characteristic that's important is they are prone to affairs, because if they have gone to this place where they've done a split on their spouse or their feelings of, I've lost that love and feeling, the feeling I felt at the very beginning, then they become despondent, but an affair buoys them up. And then they can re-idealize another person. And as they re-idealize another person, they can go back to the same pattern. This is the one I should have been with at the very beginning. So these affairs are different than the avoider affairs. Tell how this affair is different than an avoider's affair.
Well, the avoider affair would probably be a one-night stand.
Mm-hmm.
They're not interested in having sex that's relational. They're more interested in having sex that's non-relational. And that's easy to do through pornography, romance novels, or even, just...
romance. They'll have an affair through romance novels. They'll have affairs just with ideas, TV shows. They could have... get pulled off into things that put them back into that ideal state.
That's right. And it may be an emotional affair, but that's another great thing to be preoccupied about. And I think there's one more important thing that we need to say, and when we're describing the vacillator, and that is they have a lot of anxiety. Because when they're connected, they're anxious about losing it. And when they're not connected, they're anxious about having connection. And I worked with a vacillator recently, and she had her whole life tried to control her anger and was so frustrated with the fact that she just didn't understand why she couldn't manage it. And as we worked together, she realized that her anger was like a release valve for all that anxiety and all that preoccupation and all that rehearsing built up tremendous amount of anxiety. And the anger was like a vent. It was like taking the steam off the pressure cooker. And she felt better. When vacillators get disappointed, they get angry. Pleasers can get disappointed, but they're not going to show you their anger because it might mean you'll go away. But the vacillator is, when they're mad, and they're going to let you know it. Sometimes the introverted vacillators just pull away and pout, but everybody in the family knows dad's mad or mom's mad, even if they're not being loud about it. So that anger is really serving a purpose. And unless you go down to the underlying anxiety and begin to recognize that and the intensity of it and deal with that, it's very hard to change the outburst of anger because it is serving a purpose of releasing all that anxiety.
So vacillators tend to be the more angry of all the types. And because of that, they are the ones that appear to be the most volatile in the relationships. And so they can sometimes end up getting the bad rap.
Yes, they can. And it's, if someone comes to therapy and one of the partners a vacillator, you can believe it's the vacillator that got them there. They do want connection, and they sometimes go through a phase of protest and then despair and then detachment. And they can do that over and over, or they can do it over a period of time where, vacillators sometimes after they've been married a period of time think they're avoiders because they've protested, they've gone through a period of despair, and now they just don't care anymore.
They just detach.
They detach, so they look like an avoider. A lot of times vacillators think they're pleasers because they really try hard to make that connection happen, and they're charming people, they're interesting people, and they try hard to make connection happen. But the difference is they get angry. And pleasers don't get angry. So
really, the hopes and expectations of a vacillator when they go into a relationship is, I'm going to find something to fill a hole inside of me, make that anxiety go away, fill me up. And again, when they're dating, they really do feel that way. They feel very fulfilled. But as soon as the dating goes away and a person averts their gaze and starts getting busy with other things, they really start to unravel inside, and that anxiety kicks in. So do you have any other thoughts about their expectations and hopes for a relationship?
I don't think vacillators realize how completely unrealistic their hopes and expectations are.
That's a great point.
They think they're reasonable. And they think that every marriage should feel that intensity and that level of desire and passion. Vacillators often say, where did the passion go? And they don't realize that it's just a normal part of married life to have to move from the passion stage of dating and the idealizing that we really all do to reality, which is good and bad. And every day is good and bad. Every person is good and bad. Every kid is good and bad. And as long as it can stay all good, the vacillator doesn't have to feel that pain of missing and disappointment. So they fight for that all good to be there, to last. Of course, it doesn't.
Right.
So then they get angry and disappointed.
So I like that point. They have unrealistic expectations about what is going to be in the relationship. Now, from the other point of view, the person that marries them, what would a person experience who is married to a vacillator? And what I find in my office, and I'd like to hear from you, is that most of the time when they come into our offices for marriage counseling, they're past the idealized state, and now they're in a devalued state. And the person who is around this individual always feels like they're walking on eggshells because they don't know when the person is going to go to an all bad place, and then their mood shifts very quickly to a dark place. And the vacillator essentially has no control over that fast response, nor their ability to get their way out of it. It may take days to get out of that place. I remember growing up as a child, I had a parent who was a vacillator, and they would have this anxious tension. They would explode. We were all walking on eggshells, but we never knew when things were going to start smiling again. But like 5 days later, there would be a smile, and we'd all sort of get back to normal.
And the trouble with that is there's really no resolution.
Oh,
the vacillator feels better.
My stomach was upset all the time as a child.
Right. So you didn't feel better. Your dad didn't feel better.
Right.
But your mom felt better because she'd vented. And so when they decide to come back and re-engage, generally speaking, everyone else in the family re-engages, puts the smile back on because they don't want another explosion. Not because they really feel like anything's resolved, like the vacillator took any responsibility for that outburst, but just because, let's just smile and keep going so we don't have to have another crash.
So that's the general experience of a person married to a vacillator.
They often say, I have to walk on eggshells, or this is the other one I hear all the time, I can never please my spouse.
Right.
Vacillators tend to be critical because no one's meeting their ideal standard. Mm-hmm. And so the criticism is to get people to cooperate with that idealism. And so those around often feel like even the good they do goes unnoticed, and it always falls short. And in fact, it does, because the vacillator's standard is ideal.
Well, I tell vacillators in my office they have gapitis. And they go, what's gapitis? And I go, well, there's this gap between ideal and real, and you're always chafing and irritated at this gap, that your husband didn't quite do it, or your kids didn't quite do it, or your friend didn't quite do it the way you'd like to have seen it done. And I say, what's easier, changing reality in a broken world to move up to perfect and ideal, or bringing ideal down to reality, or finding sub-mid ground? And so there's this experience with, I can't ever do it right, I can't say it right, my timing's not right, I just somehow chronically dissatisfy my spouse. I hear that every day in my office. Now,
so do I.
Sexually, what is this vacillator like? If they idealize, they must be like amazing sexually.
Well, I actually think they probably are amazing sexually, especially in the early phase of a relationship. And they often push for sex early on because it's such an intense connection, and that's so satisfying to the vacillator. And so, I think the sex can be great until the disappointment sets in. And then I've worked with vacillators that have withheld sex for years. And I've worked with vacillators that use sex as a way to reconnect. They don't directly solve the problem. They don't directly talk about it, but they just offer sex, and then that's the sign that everything's okay.
And it's usually, you say withholding sex for years, it's usually the female vacillator who does that. If they idealize you and feel the husband is the person in the white hat, they're all in. As a matter of fact, they are prematurely engaged in sex. They're likely to have sex way prior to marriage, very early on in the relationship, and they also have higher rates of premarital pregnancies, and because of all that. And so that starts off that way, but then, of course, once they devalue you, they do not want to touch you anymore. And this sexually creates a highly frustrating relationship for both the husband and the wife because they remember the days before. What about as a parent? What are they like as a parent from your perspective?
Well, vacilators are very devoted parents because, again, they are going to raise the ideal family. They're going to have the family on the block that everyone says, wow, what did you do? Your kids are amazing. And so they can be really ashamed or embarrassed when their kids don't reach that ideal standard. I remember talking to a vacillator once that she would go to the park with all the other moms with the kids to play. And when her children did something wrong, she was so horrified and embarrassed that she would just leave the park. And she couldn't tolerate the fact that other people would think she wasn't a good mom. And again, all kids are good and bad. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to do things that do embarrass us. But the vacillator takes that extraordinarily personally. And they're usually very sensitive people, probably right from the womb. They have a sensitive temperament, and so they are easily hurt.
So they personalize their child's behaviors.
Yes, very much so.
They personalize their spouse's behaviors. If you embarrass me in public, it's the worst possible thing we could do. Also, what I observe, Kay, is as a parent, they're very devoted to the child. And at this point, they can end up not even seeing the spouse after a while because they have such a high focus. And a very strong presentation in my office all the time is the forgotten spouse. And it's usually the male who's the forgotten one because all the attention goes to the children because of what you mentioned earlier. The reward to the parent is so high. And along with that comes a feeling, an erroneous feeling, I might add, that therefore I am the best parent, or I have the best read on our child, I have the best judgments for our child, and I'm closest to the children, so I know what's best. Therefore, you, other spouse, my spouse, your opinions aren't as valid as mine. So there's this superiority of parenting concept that we talk about in our book, How We Love Our Kids. And that creates a triangulation with the kids. And when people walk into your office and they're severely triangulated like this, what do you see besides massive frustration?
Well, kids certainly know when parents are on different pages. And when the vacillator thinks they're the ideal parent, they devalue the other parent, and the kids begin to devalue the other parent.
Good point.
And so they see those unspoken dynamics. And the trouble is they are unspoken. They're just going on, but no one's really bringing them out into the open and talking about them. The vacillator parent has no idea the effect of anger on their children. We worked with one vacillator in a seminar, and she realized she never listened to her kids' feelings. So she went home and said to her 7-year-old daughter, I wonder how you feel when Mommy and Daddy fight. And the 7-year-old said, well, Mommy, I really don't like it because I know as soon as you and Daddy are done fighting, you're going to be really hard on me and get mad at me for everything.
Wow.
And the mom, she said, my jaw just dropped because as I started thinking about it, she was absolutely right. I was mad at everybody. And I didn't even see that in myself. And I could not believe how that one question opened up my relationship with my daughter. And it made me think a lot more seriously about how my anger was impacting my family.
Boy, that's a great story. It brought to mind one other point in my mind, that when they're angry like this and the child feels something different, also when the vacillator, male or female, is preoccupied with others, they're all of a sudden not available to their children. And so they end up giving their children intermittent connection as well, because when they're preoccupied, they don't feel and see the child.
That's so true. And they have no idea that in that preoccupation, they're probably abandoning their child in the same way they were abandoned. But that's a hard dynamic to see when you've lived with it your whole life. And you know, if we have a vacillator listening now, I can just hear them going all bad and saying, I've ruined my kids. Oh, all this is true. And, you know, our experience is kids are very resilient and they do not need a perfect parent. They just need a growing parent. they need a parent that they can see is different today than they were a year before. And when a child sees that, what a gift.
And the only way they're going to see that is if the parent talks to them and helps to explain. Like you said earlier, nobody ever sat down with me and said, let me tell you what happened back there. And so if there's no explanations and no checking into the children's feelings, children develop their own thoughts and theories as about what's going on in the home. And so...
Well, and they assume.
And they assume. And a lot of times they assume it's about them.
That's right. And I think vacilators, even as adults, they do a lot of assuming, because as kids, they were trying to figure out everything without asking questions.
Right.
And so as adults, they tend to do a lot of assuming about what you feel or what you think or what your motives are or why you did what you did. And rather than checking out that assumption, they just hold it as truth and continue on as though their assumption is absolutely correct. So we try and help vacilators really learn to see when they're assuming something and to actually check that out.
And a part of that assumption is they attribute motives and intentions to people for why they do what they do. They go to the bank on that, and then they project that onto the other person, as you said. They believe that that is true. And what a lot of spouses come into my office, and the reason they get into this tenacious, nasty core pattern is the vacillator will make a statement that includes a motivation or intention, and they project that onto the spouse. And
like, give me an example of that.
Well, they'll say, well, I noticed that you emailed everybody else in the family, but you didn't email me. And then they'll attribute a motive to that. They'll say, well, that's because we had an argument yesterday and you were punishing me, weren't you? And I know that's true. And you did not send me that email because you were punishing me. And then they're mad at them for punishing them. But they invented that little vignette. And the spouse says, no, I wasn't doing that. And they go, oh, yes, you did. And it gets into a motivation.
Yes, I did. No, you didn't.
Right. And it's I can read your mind, and I can tell you why you do what you do. So the spouse comes in and they say, what do I do with these accusations that aren't true? And I say, well, you don't go for the bait. And you simply say, if you're saying something like that, you must be really agitated inside, and let's start there. And that is a very different starting spot. So
that's so true. Just to say, one of the great lines you can use with a vacillator, whether they're a spouse or a child, is just to say, wow, you are really upset. Mm-hmm. Oh, my goodness, what happened? Mm-hmm. I can tell you're really upset. And then just let them talk. Even if you disagree, try and find out more so that you at least know what it is that they're so upset about, and leaning into it instead of avoiding it.
So we talk about comfort in our book, how we love. And do you have memories of comfort? And so a lot of times as children, we don't have memories of comfort. And why do you think the vacillator will struggle? In what way will they struggle with receiving comfort or giving comfort?
Well, it's the anger again. When a vacillator's mad, they're not going to give comfort, nor are they going to receive it. Mm-hmm. They can actually be great comforters and great listeners when they're in a good spot to do that. What I find many times when the vacillator, I've got the spouse to a point where they're really able to give that comfort, I watch the vacillator get very afraid and struggle with, oh my goodness, if I take this, I'm letting myself be vulnerable. What if I take it and it doesn't happen again? What if I take it and then I get left? And so you can just see the fear rising. And we say a lot to vacilators that they want connection, but without being vulnerable. They just want you to read their mind and figure it out. And boy, if you can just figure it out, then you must really love them. So asking for anything directly or being vulnerable by expressing a need or asking for a holding is actually really hard for the vacillator. You would think would be easy, but that vulnerability is very, very frightening for them.
So you just described anger and fear. I think there's a third factor that keeps them from being able to receive comfort, and that's shame. And because they don't want to admit, or they're out of touch with the more vulnerable feelings, as you said, inside. They're afraid of abandonment. They're afraid of separation, of not being, held into a position of high esteem. And so when they feel that, they feel a sense of shame. And so they can't accept comfort because they won't even go to that place. They just immediately go to anger, like you said, but they have high shame inside. And so they don't receive comfort well because of that. It's hard to sometimes get the vacillator to see the pain and to identify with it and then to accept and receive comfort. But we're going to talk in a moment about how important that is as a part of the healing growth journey. Were you going to say something about that?
No, I was just thinking maybe we should talk a little bit about the vacillator's strengths.
Well,
they're not all bad, you know.
That's true.
What do you think some of their strengths are?
Well, I think they are some of the most charming people on the planet.
I agree.
They're fun. They can be vivacious. They're alive. And one of the things I love about vacillators is they have a full range of emotions. Avoiders don't. They have a very constricted band of emotions. Pleasers have a very constricted band of emotions. And they are not afraid, or let's just say they are experienced with emotion.
They're expressive.
They are expressive. And when they feel good, they are some of the funnest, most just to crack up to be around.
They're often very talented individuals.
Talented, charming. They're often very smart, which is what gets them into the problem in the first place. They're analyzing, why did mom and dad not want me? And so they
see me right there.
Why don't they see me? And they think and they see and they perceive things, and then they think about it. So that's one of my favorite things about vacillators is just they're bubbly, vivacious. They're fun to be with.
You know, another thing I like is they're honest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes that honesty can be too blunt, and it can even go all the way to just downright mean. But they need to learn to speak the truth in love, but at least they speak the truth. Whereas I think avoiders don't want the conflict, and pleasers are just afraid of the truth because you might get mad at me and go away. So they're direct. And some of our favorite therapists are recovered vacillators because they're very insightful and they're really able to be direct with clients when they need to be.
I think that's really important to say because they're not afraid. I've seen pleaser therapists that take months to confront a client about something, and that just doesn't work. I think vacillators, in my opinion, if they're a recovering vacillator, can make some of the best, most intuitive therapists that we've seen, and I think I would agree with you on that. Now, when they marry, if we were going to say what stresses them the most, I would say. Let me start off by saying it comes under the theme of abandonment, and inside of that, it's somehow there's a separation that I feel from you. It could be an averted gaze. It could be you're focused on something else at that moment, which they then perceive that you have an averted gaze or you're attentive to something else. That all of a sudden scares the bejeebers out of them. I just made up a new word. And they fear abandonment, and so they react in a highly panicky place. And I would say that would be one of the things that will be the stressor of a vacillator in a marriage relationship. What would you add to that?
I would agree. I think the anxiety quickly turns to anger. You know, abandonment can be very blatant. Mm-hmm. When you're growing up, maybe your parents divorced or maybe one of your parents died. Or it can be very subtle. I've worked with families where there was a marriage that was still intact with the parents, but when we kind of dug down into the past, what we often saw was a parent that was here and then gone, here and then gone. And even though they were physically present, they weren't emotionally present. Mm-hmm. And believe me, the vacillator knows if you're emotionally present or if you're not. They're very tuned in to the presence of other people or the lack of presence of other people.
Well, there is no emotional distance in dating, is there?
Not much.
It's just this, I see you, and there's this lock of a gaze, and both literally and metaphorically, there's just this impassioned emotional connection. Then all of a sudden, life happens, and so they can become either emotionally distant. Let's say, especially if they're an avoider, they become highly emotionally dismissive and distant, which is one of the traits and characteristics of the avoider. Or just life causes me to not see you and be emotionally distant.
Right. And I think waiting is a trigger for the vacillator because they begin to feel abandoned in that waiting. They, as kids, were waiting for time and attention, and it was not within their power when it was going to be offered. And as adults, they tend to take that same childhood perspective, like everybody else has their life and everyone's going to make me wait. And so they're just waiting for someone to be available versus initiating or asking directly for what they want or need.
You know, when they feel separation anxiety and they get triggered, what happens is any and all historical supporting events all flood into the present, and they create this composite historical event of hurt. And so they can't separate the past from the present when they are triggered. And so the spouse becomes a lightning rod right there, perhaps inappropriately. And this is why for the vacillator, the reaction doesn't always match the infraction.
That's right. I think they often don't see the connection between their childhood history and their current behaviors. That their spouse, when they're made to wait or their spouse isn't available or doesn't see them, they are touching an old childhood wound. And that wound is unresolved and unhealed. And so the vacillator's response is not just historical through the marriage, and they're very good at remembering all the infractions, but it's even historical all the way back into childhood and infancy even.
We had a call recently on the radio where a lady said, how do I cope with my emotionally distant husband? And she says, I ended up drinking for 10 years to manage my pain. I've been sober for 2 years. How do I cope with his distance and then she told some stories. She said, she'll be in his presence. She'll say, am I pretty? Am I attractive? How much do you love me? And she asked him all these questions. And I said to her, there's got to be a backstory there. What happened to you as a little child with respect to attentiveness? And there's this long pause, and she says, I always struggled to get my dad's attention. He never gave me any.
There you go.
And now here she is, desperately seeking to get her husband's attention, but with all those questions and activity and energy, she overwhelms him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say the most frequent mistake in the dysfunctional dance that the vacillator makes is when they get panicky and scared, they get catastrophic. They think the whole world is going to end, that this is fatal and final, and they overwhelm people instead of, as you said a moment ago, simply asking what they feel and then asking for someone to meet that need.
I agree. I think whether a vacillator marries a pleaser or an avoider, they're often attracted to the avoider because the avoider is so consistent and reliable and predictable. Mm-hmm. And they don't really realize till later on that they're not good at connecting. The pleaser is very attentive in their own way, which the vacillator initially loves. But what they find as life goes on is that the pleaser doesn't really want to get too real about any problems. They want to make you happy in a superficial way and have superficial conversations, and the pleaser is going to avoid the depth of connection that the vacillator is hoping for. So whether they marry a pleaser and avoider, which is the most common, they begin to get more and more angry about this lack of ideal being met, and that pushes the pleaser into a frantic try harder.
Right.
And the avoider, it just pushes them further away. So many times, I think you would agree that the avoider vacillator is one of the most common presentations in therapy as a couple, because you can see how painful the dance is. The avoider doesn't know I want connection. They don't have enough connection in their family to even know what that is.
They don't know the definition of it. It's not.
They've never experienced it.
The vacillator gets mad at the avoider as though they're withholding something they know how to do.
All right.
And they don't know how.
They don't know how. And of course, then the vacillator takes that personally. You just don't love me enough. You don't try hard enough. And they get angry, which pushes the avoider further away. And so it's just a nasty dance that is a very painful dance.
Well, obviously, while a vacillator has strengths, and they can be wonderfully intense and strong in their capacities, even to lead people into wonderful places, for instance, in the church of worship, et cetera, and they can have a lot of great attributes, but there are places where they don't resemble Christ. So if you would say there would be one or two things that we want to, in these CDs, we want to really highlight how can a person grow from this place. So let's start off by asking, where do they not resemble Christ? And I would start off by saying Christ was very comfortable with being alone and separated from people. And whereas the vacillator, like the pleaser, always has to have someone close. And to be able to allow people to walk away and not interpret that in a catastrophic way, that would more resemble Christ. I love the closeness that vacillators want. It's super. It's just that if they feel like it starts to just crumble a bit, they get panicky. And Jesus didn't get panicky at closeness and distance and separating and coming and going.
Yeah, I think a healthy relationship, there's breathing room.
Right.
You can separate, and then you come back together, and you separate, and you come back together. And there's a healthy rhythm there, and in a great marriage, whereas the vacillator is very threatened by any sort of separation. I think you use a great analogy. You use breathing as an example of that process.
Well, we inhale, and then we exhale, and we do that so rhythmically that we don't even think about it. But if I get stuck on exhaling, and I get stuck there for a long period of time, I'm going to black out and die. If I get stuck on an inhale and I can't get it out, same thing. And so it's kind of like bonding and separation. We inhale and we connect with people, and then we exhale and we separate from them. And it's not permanent, but it's inhaling and exhaling. A great relationship allows the inhaling and exhaling. And I think that is what Christ was like. But as we talk about, the Bible talks about perfect love casts out fear. Vacillators are very fearful at their core. And so one of the things they really fear, like we're saying right here, is it's terrorizing for them to tolerate separation. And I want you so close to me that any hint of separation terrorizes me. So that is one of the principal fears inside of the vacillator. So we would say separation is a fear, abandonment is a fear. What about rejection? That's a fear.
Rejection is certainly a fear, and it feels just fatal and final, as though, and that's why I think the anger comes in, and many times the vacillator will reject before rejected. They'd rather be in the driver's seat in terms of rejection. So if someone disappoints them long enough, they say things like, I'm done, that's it. And many times that means they're cutting off the relationship, or at least they're done for a period of time, and they're going to detach for a while. And really, it looks like punishment. I think it's really about collecting themselves again.
Right. So they have fears also for asking to have their needs met. They're afraid to ask. If they ask, they think it's a second-class love, that if you really loved them, that you would just know what they want. And so I think they fear risking to ask, and they then idealize and hope that you'll just know.
That is so true. And asking is just a part of life. Jesus asked his disciples to go get food when he was with the woman at the well. He asked for his friends to be close to him in the garden. So we see many examples of Jesus asking, and that's what we have to all do. And of course, it'd be magical if everyone just knew our need and met it without us even having to ask. But that period is really only lasts in our lives for about the first year, where you do the best you can to read a baby's mind because they can't talk. But of course, when they talk, hopefully the parent is learning or teaching them to ask. And many times that just didn't happen in the home of the vacillator.
So it is the reactivity of the avoider, the reactivity of the pleaser, and the reactivity of the vacillator. One will flee, the avoider, the pleaser will freeze, and the vacillator will fight.
That's right. Those are the common responses to stress.
Mm-hmm.
And the vacillator handles the stress in relationships and the times that they're triggered by being angry.
Now, that's how we all start out, okay? As we grow, what are some of the key steps? And I know you and I have a heart here to help vacillator, really all the attachment styles, get to a place where they're growing. These places of freezing, fleeing, and fighting, they sabotage the very love we want. And they destroy, all of them cause the disintegration of relationship. So we've already talked about previously the avoider and the pleaser growth challenges. How can the vacillator grow into a person that is healthier and doesn't get tied up into these dysfunctional dances so quickly? So what would be some of the things you might say?
Well, one of the first growth goals is they just have to own that something is broken in them.
Mm-hmm.
They are so good at reading others and for their level of connection or disconnection that they tend to have an outward focus and blame other people for their pain. And really...
Isn't that the universal thing they say when they come into our offices?
Yes. You know, if my spouse would do this and if my spouse wouldn't do that, everything would be fine.
You fix them.
And yeah, you need to fix them.
Yep.
And that's why I brought them here, so that you can fix them. But, you know, we've had so many people, so many emails of people who've read the book or come to one of our workshops say, I have never heard such a clear description of myself. I have never understood myself. And for the first time, I feel like I have an understanding of why I feel like I feel and why I do what I do. And that is a great starting point, because they begin to see that they do have a contribution to the dysfunctional dance and that they have something to own as well. And when a vacillator just says to their spouse, oh my gosh, I see I contribute to this problem, I think their spouses can either cry with joy or jump up and down and applaud, because they've been the focus of the blame for so long.
You know, this is just such an important starting spot, an honest assessment of self. And really what we're saying here with these attachment styles is this is not like some rare disease. They're common. There's so many of us like this, but if we can create a definition where there is a diagnosis, there is a cure, there is a path for healing. And that's why we love our work, because we see people grow every day out of these attachment styles. So, but they do, Kay, have to focus on themselves all of a sudden instead of others. What else would you say? Anything else?
Well, I think asking for what you want directly is really important. Learning to make an I feel, I need statement. I feel lonely. I need 15 minutes of just eyeball to eyeball time with you tonight. To make their request reasonable, vacillators tend to be vague, like, I just want you to connect with me, or I just want you to be present. Well, what does that really mean? And I think when you make a request that's very specific and doable, many times spouses are more than happy to meet that need if it's defined for them, especially avoiders. So asking for something concrete, measurable, and doable instead of vague and global is an important growth goal. And I think when you put it into a I feel, I need format and think that through ahead of time, then often the spouse will have something more concrete to work with.
That's really an important point, and I appreciate you making that point. Along with that comes the concept of, and in order to have that ability to articulate what you need to be able to get sad, not mad. If your first thing is to flash into anger, you cannot have what you just said, that place where you're reflective and contemplative and you stop and ask, what is it I'm looking for? And then we are reactive and we make global statements, and those global statements can be so destructive. Instead of saying, you never come home on time, to say what you said, you know what, I've been missing you. I need connection time. I really want to have a half hour where we can sit down without the TV and the kids and just spend some time catching up. And that's a very different request. But that necessitates them getting more sad than mad.
That's right. Vacillators, the anger they feel tends to take them out of a contemplative mode. So we ask the vacillator to use their anger as a signal that there's more vulnerable feelings Maybe they just happened so quickly they didn't even know what they were. But this is where the feeling word list is so important. And of course, you can download a feeling word list for free on our website if you haven't gotten the book yet. And for the vacillator to take their anger, go get the feeling word list before they start spouting off and say, what else do I feel besides anger? And then to use the more vulnerable feelings as a starting point of expressing their feelings and needs. It's hard to hug a porcupine. So many vacillators will say, all I really need is a hug. If she would just hug me, if he would just hug me. And I'm like, well, you've got your quills out. Mm-hmm. You're angry. Mm-hmm. And you think a hug is just going to make it all better, but you're communicating that you don't want to be hugged or touched or held. And so,
which is that ambivalence we talked about earlier.
There is some ambivalence. And I think learning to express the more vulnerable feelings is really important. And I think what I notice with vacilators is that most of them, if they cry, it's very angry, frustrated tears. They really don't often cry broken-hearted tears. And generally, whatever the abandonment was in their past has never really been processed from a broken-hearted point of view. It's more from a blame point of view. And, they can still be embroiled with all the disappointments they have with their parent or parents versus just grieving those losses and accepting their parents are who they are, they did the best they could, and learning to have healthy relationships with people who are in their life that might be able to go further than family members can go in terms of healing.
And along with this would come the realization that it is the hurt in my family of origin as a child that is the origin of so much of my pain to this very day, not my spouse. And so that's an important turn that they have to make. As they own it, they have to cry and grieve the loss of really the original thing that was the hurtful place. And again, we're not here to blame the parents. We're just simply here to explain why we are what we are.
Once you can do that, then everything doesn't have to be so perfect.
That was a turning point in our marriage when both of us could understand that our current reactivity with each other at the 15-year mark, we began to have some ahas. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary, but 25 years ago, we had these ahas that our current struggle was really driven by past hurts and wounds. And that was liberating to us.
It was liberating because you realize your spouse isn't purposefully trying to hurt you. They're doing the dance they've done since they were little kids. And the dance is so familiar, no one's ever even identified the dance steps. So understanding your part and taking responsibility for that and going through the workbook, the back of our paperback has a whole workbook section just for the vacillator, just for the avoider, just for the pleaser. And those growth goals are detailed, and we just say take them one at a time and go slow so that you don't get overwhelmed.
Thanks for bringing that up. I think another important thing is they have to learn to allow people to be different and to be other individuals that have different tastes and preferences and opinions and desires and thoughts, and not view that as oppositional or a rejection of them. Often a different opinion is viewed as an abandonment of them. And they have to learn to tolerate the differences of other people, their children, their husbands, wives, that I let you have an opinion different than mine. Vacilators don't tolerate difference very much. They think that a different viewpoint means you've rejected me. They interpret, again, a different viewpoint as criticism, or I should say rejection.
A different viewpoint might also mean, that doesn't match my ideal standard. Mm-hmm. I like to listen to Christian music. Well, I like to listen to rock and roll once in a while. Well, no, that's bad. That doesn't meet my ideal. You can't listen to that. And so for the vacillator, it's like the differing opinions really threaten their ideal standard. And so, if you can just get everyone to see things the way you see it, then maybe your ideal can be met.
And yet, again, trying to force reality into ideal is really hard. Along with this, and tightly coupled with this, is vacilators don't allow themselves to be criticized, questioned, challenged, opposed, and they really resist anybody questioning them. Why do you do that? They have such high shame factors that to question them feels condescending and shaming. So they often interpret a person having a response back of opposition or clarification as being a statement that is shaming and condemning.
That's such an important point, because probably at any time on any given day before a vacillator begins to see these things and grow, either they're good or bad, or someone else is good or bad. Either their focus is internal and I'm all good or I'm all bad, or their focus is external on their spouse and they're all good or they're all bad. There's very little middle ground. And so when the vacillator is in those private places beating themselves up for getting angry or for saying the wrong thing, no one knows that. No one knows that they have this very heavy hand on themselves when they don't reach perfection. And so when someone else points it out, it's almost like too much for them. They've already beat themselves up. And trouble is, no one knows that. Mm-hmm. And so if they can just be honest and say out loud, I really feel bad about what I said, or I need to apologize. Apologizing is so hard for the vacillator because it means they're all bad.
Right.
And they can't integrate that I could do something wrong and own it and apologize for it, but it doesn't mean I'm all bad. I still have good parts. I still have good qualities. I'm still lovable. And that's really hard for them to grasp.
So we call this integrating good and bad. Not just us, but many other people as well. And this is a really hard thing to learn, but this is important because idealization is the ceiling of the room. Devaluing is the floor. And that's where they live their life for themselves and others. You're either in the ceiling, you're at the best possible place, or you're on the floor. At the worst possible place, really where life is lived, where we're sitting right now, is in the middle of the room, which is to integrate. And the Apostle Paul said, I'm convinced that there's two things going on inside of me in Romans 7. The wishing to do good, and then there's the evil, the flesh that just wants to go in a different direction. And he says they're always warring within me. He says the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do, I end up doing. And he's able to recognize that there is this battle. He accepts that this is a realistic battle inside himself.
It's called being human.
It is being human.
And vacillators don't let others or themselves be human.
Isn't that exhausting?
It's so exhausting. And I have to just say, my heart, and I know yours too, it really goes out to the vacillator because they do experience so much pain on a daily basis. And, our hearts are so elated when we see them grow to a place where life isn't so painful and they accept middle more and more. And I love to quote a gal that came up to me. I wish I knew her name. At a workshop.
I love this quote.
And we'd been in this city a year before, and we're back again to do a parenting workshop. And she said, I'm a vacillator. I was at your seminar a year ago. And she says, every single day I say to myself, today is not going to be as good as you think it will be. And it never is. Something always goes wrong. And then I say to myself, this is not as bad as you think it is. And she said, you know what that's doing? It's helping me find a middle. And she says, I'm checking my idealizing and I'm checking my devaluation. And she says, it's changing my life. And I told her, I'm going to quote you. That is brilliant.
It is a brilliant statement. And it truly indicates the journey that the vacillator must choose to go on. We tell people all the time, you can't help the hand that was dealt to you, but you have to learn to play it. And we don't want to stay with that bad hand. We always have to trade in and try and get a better position in life. And this is one of those places where we can work hard to increase that position. Along with that, these are things that people just can't do alone. You could try to do all these growth things by yourself. But one of the things we always recommend, and one of the most important biblical concepts, is the body of Christ. And learning to confess our sins one to another, pray for one another, comfort, encourage one another, bear one another's burdens. And I think the church misses it because we often don't stop and ask, how can I really pray for you today? What growth areas are you trying to make in your own life that will cause you to more resemble Christ? Where are you struggling? And because it does take a herd, it does take a group of people, and that's what the body of Christ is all about. But all of us struggle to take our personal struggles into relationship with community. But community is vital. If we are hurt in community, we also are healed in community.
And that can go beyond your marriage.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes when vacilators are disappointed long enough, they kind of have this idea, well, I'm not changing until you change. I'm not doing anything. I've worked so hard. You've done nothing. I'm not going to change until you show change. And we just really encourage the vacillator to realize that we want them to change primarily and foremost because they're going to be a happier person. Not just for everybody else, but because
they'll be happier.
They'll be happier.
Right.
And we've seen that happen in the people that we've worked with. And it's a joy to see vacilators be able to use all their delightful skills and charm and talents without the level of pain and angst that they've lived with for so many years.
So, some of the most enjoyable people, if they're working on their issues, to be around for us are vacilators. Be of good cheer. But if we're not working on our issues, then for the avoider, pleaser, vacillator, it's not going to be as enjoyable for people to be around. Well, we've had a good discussion here on the vacillator, and this ends the dialogue on the vacillator, and we hope it has been eye-opening for you, as well as helpful toward growth and change. This and other resources, as well as access to a weekly blog and our upcoming appearances, may be found at howwelove.com. And for Kay and myself, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.